I'm going to walk you through how to assemble the final scope and sequence for your unit. I'm going to use the 10th grade biology unit as an example, as it includes subthematic questions instead of the 5th grade example, which does not. I want you to see the graphic organizer using all of the steps. Remember that many units may not include subthematic questions, and so that step is skipped in those cases. The first step is to create a big picture outline of the unit to use as a reference. Therefore, step 1 is simply an outline format of the essential questions. You can see in my example, I have all 3 levels of questions: thematic, subthematic, and guiding. Also note that if you have subthematic questions, you should have at least 2. Otherwise, what's the point, since it isn't breaking the unit into smaller subunits? Step 1 provides the scope of the unit by showing the content and summative assessment of the unit. I've taken the thematic question from the draft scope I did as the first step of the unit design process. The KDUs come right from the draft guiding questions and KDUs document. Note that this example doesn't show all that I actually used in this unit, so that I could fit it on one page in the book. The more complete you make this list, the easier the rest of the steps will be. And lastly, I've got a detailed description of the summative assessment that aligns to the thematic question. Since I had subthematic questions, I completed step 2A. If you don't have STQs, then you can delete these pages from your final scope and sequence. I identified 2 subtopics in my theme chunking stage of the unit design and pulled these questions from that document, though the wording of the questions has been changed and updated. I literally cut and pasted the KDUs from the Step 2 page, and I got those from the draft GQs and KDUs document. The more thoroughly those previous steps were done, the easier this step is, as it is now just aligning the KDUs to each subtopic, which helps me identify how big each subtopic is. You might find that you think of more as you are doing this step, and then you should add those as well. Since this is a pretty big unit, each subtopic will have its own graded formative assessment that is described in detail here. These should align to the STQ and also then align to the thematic question from the previous page. The last step is where we get to dig into more specifics of what will actually happen in this unit. So now I'm building the sequence part of the scope and sequence. I'm just showing you 2 of the guiding questions for my example. You will use one of these graphic organizers for each guiding question. My unit has 6 guiding questions, 3 for each STQ, which is just a coincidence. It doesn't have to be an equal amount for each STQ. So I would have 6 of these individual tables in my final scope and sequence. The first guiding question is labeled 1.1 since it is the first guiding question for subthematic question 1. The second is 1.2, the third is 1.3. If there are more, it would continue 1.4 and so on. Then the guiding questions for the next STQ would be labeled 2.1, 2.2, and so on. The KDUs are literally cut and pasted from the STQ page. So again, the more thoroughly the previous steps are done, the more at this point you are just identifying the specific guiding question they align to. You might also edit and add at this point as you go. Remember, it's an iterative process. Okay, now you get to trip the activity trap. Now, while we aren't lesson planning yet, we are brainstorming and listing all the possible learning activities or formative assessments that will be needed for each guiding question. This helps you identify specific lessons and how many individual lessons it might take to actually teach this question. And lastly, aligning the standards to the guiding questions. You should be able to pull these straight from the Unpacking Standards document. Now let's put all this back into the big picture of curriculum design. We start with the thematic question, an idea for the final goal of the unit, which outlines the broad scope of the unit. We identify the guiding questions and possibly the sub-thematic questions, and the KDUs for the unit. This further illuminates the breadth of the scope of the unit. Then we brainstorm possible learning activities, which also serve as our formative assessments throughout the learning process. Then the next thing that is to happen is to design well thought out and engaging, student-centered, inquiry-based lessons. That's part 4 of the book. These lessons facilitate students learning the KDUs so they can answer, in some way, the guiding questions, which allows them to then complete the final summative expectations and demonstrate their understanding for the thematic question. Nothing to it.